Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Today I'm going to try to convince you that the most important thing you can do within this 24-hour span is not, first and foremost, to call your mom. The most important thing that you can do is not to get your mom a card or to get her some flowers. The first and most important thing that you could do for your mother today is give her some rest. Give her rest. And the question of what rest means, though, is of extreme importance, because when the Bible speaks of rest, and as we speak of rest together this morning, we're talking about more than a few minutes to put your feet up, although it is not less than that. We're talking about more than being able to put your labors aside, although it is not less than that. When we talk about rest, we're talking about more than leisure, even though it's not less than that. Rest is one of God's primary concerns throughout the Scriptures. One of the things that makes the God of the Bible completely unique from every other God is that we were not made for the purpose of accomplishing something first and foremost for God. We were not made for the purpose of doing something so that God does not have to. What we were ultimately made for, even though God did make us to work, it was always toward an end. It was that we might rest and enjoy Him. We're going to be looking at the Sabbath today, the command to remember the Sabbath. And some, when you hear that phrase, a number of different things might run through your mind. You might think of something from a bygone era, the 50s and the 60s, with their blue laws and everything being closed on Sundays and sitting on grandma's porch and making ice cream. To some, when you hear the Sabbath, you might think of this ancient Jewish tradition that's kind of interesting and bizarre, but it's not really to be bothered with or to claim to have any relevance today. And some of you hear Sabbath, and maybe if you grew up in a home with a particular kind of religious culture, that was the day where you could do nothing. It was the one day that was kind of, you knew you were going to be at church, you knew you were going to worship, but then you're going to sit at home on your hands and attempt not to move too much lest you anger God. But what I want to suggest is that if we take this command seriously, this Sabbath, this call to have one day in 7 set aside for rest and enjoying the goodness of the Lord, is that we are going to rediscover a lost gift from God. We're going to discover a kind of secret tool, a key that's been hidden in plain sight for you to grow in your understanding of the gospel. Now, as we think of the commandments, and we've been walking through them one by one, there is no commandment, just speaking personally, that I have wrestled more with over the past several years to know, what do we do with this command? How do we put this into practice? Does it continue to have any sort of relevance for us? And as I've wrestled with this, I found that I actually care about this greatly. And I really believe that if we hear this well, if you hear this well and apply it wisely in your life, it can change your life, both in the basic structure of it, but also in its character, in its quality, and what animates you. I'm going to be making a case as we look at this text just to kind of set up. I'm going to be making a case that I assume is actually probably the minority stance in this room. I'm going to be arguing actually that I believe this command has an abiding relevance for us today, that does not disappear with the coming of Jesus. That there is something here that is worth us attending to and that we should take it seriously. And though that might strike you as odd now, and you might be looking at me like I'm like a creature from the zoo or something, or like a Puritan from the 1700s, what I'm going to be arguing, I think, is more or less what was normal for most of Protestant history. And before you think I'm teaching just moralism or just that I got everyone here on Mother's Day just to tell you that you're not doing something right, what I want to be saying is what would experiencing the peace of God, the things that we've sung about this morning, rest in Christ, knowing that his work is what matters and not ours, what would experiencing that look like now? If you were to get concrete and practical and say, what does experiencing the peace offered by Jesus look like now? That's what this command is about. So we're going to jump in. But one final thing, just one last thing to note. We got a lot to cover here. We might have to kind of finish this up in another setting at another time. But ask questions as we walk, not as we walk through this, but as you're thinking this, don't ask them out loud, but take note. Ask me questions during the week. Let's just explore and see what this commandment has to say. So first, let's jump in. Let's just kind of explore this commandment. Let's see what this commandment shows us. Let's read again, verse 8, Exodus chapter 20. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This is the first commandment that we arrive at. As Moses has been walking through this list over the past few weeks, this is the first one that is a positive statement. All the other ones up to this point have been do not, or you shall not. Do not worship any other gods. Do not make any images. Do not take the name of God in vain. And now this one and the next commandment change the pace a little bit. They suddenly become positive. It doesn't say do not do something here. It says do something. Remember the Sabbath. Remember what this word Sabbath means is remember the rest day. When it says Sabbath is just the Hebrew word for rest. Remember the day of rest and keep it holy. And then that's verse 8, and the rest of it is unpacking that verses 9 and 10, telling us what does that look like, and verse 11 is giving us the reasoning for why. But this is not the first time that this idea of Sabbath has shown up already in the book of Exodus. Already so far in Exodus, we've seen God command a Sabbath for the people of Israel. If you remember back in Exodus chapter 16, God's people have found themselves in the wilderness and they find that they have no food. They're not able to provide for themselves because they're in a desert. There's no food around them. And God sets up this thing where he's going to give them manna, this bread from heaven, daily. And every day they're supposed to go out and gather what they need for the day, keep nothing for the next day, until they get to the sixth day. And then God says, tomorrow is a Sabbath day. It's a rest day for the Lord. Take a double portion and keep it, and do not expect bread tomorrow. Tomorrow you are to rest. We're given this picture here that what they're ultimately called to do is not toil and labor and work every day, but ultimately they're going to have to trust God to provide for them tomorrow. God's establishing this rhythm of trust for them in their lives. Day by day, they're going to have to trust that God's going to give them what they need for the day until they come to the day at the end of the week where they're going to have to trust that we can do nothing. What God is doing is he's giving them this rhythm in their life that centers them on God. Just picture what that was like every day if you had to gather your food daily off of the ground around you. We're used to buying food for the week or for a couple days, and we maybe run out to the grocery store if we forget something. But for them, every day was a question, where would our food come from? Every day they would be reminded our food comes from God. Until day 7, this last day of the week, where what they had gathered the day before would prove to be enough. God has already appealed to the people to remember a day of rest. We're there to be reminded that their God is not like the God that they have been rescued from. Pharaoh made them work endlessly. Pharaoh gave them work and then gave them more work. But God gives them rest. But, notice here, look at verse 11 in Exodus 20. That's not the reasoning that the Lord gives for why they're to remember the Sabbath. Notice that. You look at this command, and it doesn't say, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, etc., because God promised to give you bread, and on the seventh day you should rest. That's not what God points to. Instead, he says, what does he say? He says, in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. God is referencing all the way back to Genesis, when God made all things. Genesis 1 begins with this creation week where God makes everything in its proper place. And each day ends with this cycle. It was evening and morning the first day. It was evening and morning the second day. And then the sixth day, God makes mankind, makes them in his image, places them in the garden, and says, you shall have dominion over this, work the ground. And then the seventh day, the day after mankind is made, verse 1 of Genesis chapter 2, it says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. The ultimate peak of the week, the big grand finale of this created order that God makes. God decides to create a week that is 7 days long, and the final day, the thing that everything has been set aside for, everything is in its proper place. Human beings have been placed down, and now they're set to enjoy. What does God have for us tomorrow? And the thing that God makes the next day is simply one of rest. And God does not rest because he is tired. God rests because there's no other work to be done. The image is almost like a king resting upon his throne. Everything is as it should be. God enjoys this day. And of all the things that we see in Scripture that God blesses, they're almost always people or families or nations. Here we are told a day that God blesses, the seventh day. God blesses, he makes it holy for his people to enjoy. And then notice the pattern breaks here as well. There's no pattern at the end that says, and there is evening and morning. It's as if that day did not really end. It's still out there. It's something to be enjoyed. And I think the idea that we're supposed to get from this text here is, what were we ultimately made for? To enjoy God. The ultimate purpose of us being made on day 6 was so that we could experience day 7. God could have made everything all at once. It wasn't that God had to create everything in this particular order, that there was too much work for God, that God could have spoken everything into existence in one moment, but instead he creates in this intentional pattern. Why? So that this one day would be set out for God. And then the Israelites, when they're given this commandment then in Exodus chapter 20, when it said, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Why? Because God created the earth in 6 days and then on the seventh day rested. What they're being told to do is they're reenacting who their God is day by day by day and week by week by week. The people who gathered around them could look and say, what was their God? Who is Israel's God like? And they could look at their lives and say, they believe in a God who rested on the seventh day. Something about God was being shown. In a sense, Israelites were embodying who God was to the rest of the world. If these people are supposed to be the ones who know the true God, if they're the ones who are not supposed to make any images but hear by faith, if they're the ones who are supposed to take the name of God upon themselves and bear that image out to the world, essential to that for God's people was living their week the way God did. Following in this pattern, resting day by day, week by week. remember the Sabbath, for God made in six and rested on the seventh. The other thing to note here is in the book of Deuteronomy, we're given a different reason. You see, Moses actually repeats the Ten Commandments later on in the book of Deuteronomy, and this one changes. This one shifts. So Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. Verse 13 is the same. Verse 14 is the same. And then verse 15, this is where it changes. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day holy. So God speaks to his people and says, you shall not work, and your servants, your slaves, they shall not work. Why? Because you were rescued from slavery. You were brought out of it. You used to be in a place where you were given no rest. You had no ability to recover. You had no ability to rejuvenate yourself. But this God, this Lord is different. He gives you rest. Remember that you were slaves and now therefore receive this as a gift from God. Do not enslave yourself to something again, but simply enjoy what is being given to you. And one thing that's remarkable with this command is just how even it is across the board. It's not just that the wealthy are not supposed to work. It's not just that the hard workers are not supposed to work. It's that no one is supposed to work. You or your male servant or your female servant or your son or your daughter or even your livestock, let all of them rest. It was this constant picture that what you were made for was not to exhaust yourself into nothingness. And the reason that God gives in Deuteronomy is not, he doesn't point back to the creation. He doesn't point to the way that God made everything originally. Instead, he points to their redemption. This was the way things were made in Exodus 20. And this is what God has done for you, Deuteronomy 5. This rest pattern ties both of those together. What were we ultimately made for? Enjoying God. What has God ultimately rescued us for? Enjoying God. God rescued the people of Israel so that they might enjoy what God had originally designed for all of us to experience, what we were separated from in sin. And God's people were called in Exodus on a weekly basis to remember this again and again and again. And that's why, when you read the Old Testament, you'll see this show up over and over and over again. It just seems to come out of nowhere. It'll just suddenly, someone will break the Sabbath and then everything will go crazy. And then you'll be reading the prophets and it'll be talking about judgment and sin and all this stuff. And they'll say, but if you keep the Sabbaths and you remember the Sabbath, then everything will be okay. You'll be restored. And what's the idea there? It's not that God just kind of dangling this out there, that they have to be obedient up to a certain point. The Sabbath kind of becomes this picture, this seal, this idea that it shows their utterly unique relationship to God. It shows their connection to God in a way that nothing else does, because they could confess that they belonged to the Lord all they wanted. They could say that they believed in the Lord, but if they were not living it out in the most basic way possible, simply resting one day a week, then they were showing themselves not to truly believe that their God had rescued them. They were showing that they were still slaves. That's why later on in Exodus 31, we're going to see this again. He says, Exodus 31, verse 13, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify or make holy you. It's a sign of their relationship to God. And then we need to see that basic idea so that we can understand, well, where are all these other festivals and holidays and sacrifices? Where are all of these coming from throughout the Old Testament? This is really important for us to get. How many of you have read, tried to read the Old Testament, or you have read the Old Testament and you just get to this list of festivals and sacrifices and it says, on this day of the week, on this month, you're supposed to do all of this. Here, I'm going to kind of simplify all of it for you so you can kind of understand what is ultimately being taught here. What they are being given, they're given the Sabbath, and then their entire festival structure, it's all built on it's a structure on top of that basic day. So you read through all the commands about all the festivals and everything like that, and it's always going to be on the seventh day, or you should do this, and then 7 days later, you should do this, and then on the seventh week, you should do this. Essentially, you're getting this structure. All of it's being built on this idea of 6 and 1, 6 and 1, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. And even the year of Jubilee, this day where everyone's supposed to be freed, all the slaves are supposed to be let go, all debts are supposed to be canceled, even that is supposed to follow after this period of 7 years times 7 years. This structure runs all the way through the basic idea, but the fundamental idea never disappears. Rest on the seventh day. Everything else is trying to essentially explain, well, how is it ultimately that we are going to have this rest? It's through sacrifice, it's through these temples, it's through all of this other stuff. That stuff's kind of illustrating the basic idea that we were made to enjoy God. And all of that's to say, what is the idea here? The Sabbath for the people of God. It's supposed to show who is their God and what has he done for them. Who is their God and what has he done for them? And this becomes a sore spot in their relationship. Now imagine this for a second. If your employer was to come to you and say, I've been thinking about it and I've come up with a new job requirement for you. And you say, well, it just sounds like a Tuesday. But really, so they come and they say, I've come up with this as a new requirement. You have to do this for you to remain employed here. And they say, I want you to take 52 days off. I want you to have 52 days where you do nothing for me. How many of you would buck at that? And say, that is oppressive, that is harsh, I can't believe you'd ask me of that. I'm going to report that to Human Services or HR. Of course you wouldn't. But the people who are given this command to enjoy this, they decide not to, and instead this day ends up becoming a day where they are oppressing others, they're seeking to, they're manipulating it so that they can get more money from other people, they're waiting for it to end so that they can go and sell their goods. And so God will be able to speak to his people, and when he's talking about the work he's going to do in the new covenant, restoring everything, freeing us from sin, making a new life with him, he's going to do so speaking about the Sabbath. Isaiah 58, verse 13, if you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord. I'll make you ride on the heights of the earth. I'll feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Or Isaiah 56, where God's going to speak, and he's going to be talking to those who are not allowed to enter into the presence of God, speaking to eunuchs, those who have been disfigured and are therefore ritually unclean. But he says, to those who keep my Sabbaths, who hold fast to my covenant, they will be able to come near to me. And this is all new covenant promises. This is all stuff that's supposed to happen with Jesus. Now, what does it mean to keep a Sabbath? I don't think the basic idea is, well, you just do this legalistic thing, and therefore you make the cut. I think it's instead supposed to be this kind of picture of a life lived with God. So that's the Old Testament. We see this idea run all the way through the Old Testament. God's people are called to rest. God's people are called to enjoy God, and they're called to enjoy him not just in a way that they choose for themselves, not by just having arbitrary days, but by this corporate gathering together to cease from work and enjoy what God's given them. Give themselves over to this day, this seventh day. And you say, that sounds great, but that's not us. Right? All of that sounds really, really great if you lived as an Old Testament Jew, but that's not really who we are. So how does that matter to us? And doesn't Jesus change this? And doesn't Jesus come around and mix all this up and make it different for us? How does this still remain for us? I'm glad you asked. That's what we're going to look at next. Mark Mark 2, you get this situation where the people of Israel, or where the leaders of Israel are criticizing Jesus and his disciples because it looks like his disciples are picking grain and therefore working on the Sabbath. Verse 23, Mark 2. One Sabbath he was going through their grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Isn't that kind of like our big hang up with like the Sabbath stuff? Is it just sounds like you're just going to be this guy who's just like looking and see if anyone's having fun or like nourishing themselves or doing anything enjoyable, and you're just going to criticize them? Isn't that like our fear if we become like serious about this? And then verse 25, "Have you never read what David did? When he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who are with him. He said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." What's the idea here? Jesus' disciples are being accused of breaking this commandment. Jesus points to David, who says, look, they ate bread and they did this work. Shouldn't they be allowed to do that? And then he says the Sabbath is made for man. But notice what is not said in this text. Whatever is going on with Abiathar and everything else there, what is not said, Jesus never says the Sabbath is not valid. Jesus never looks at his people and says, you know, that's kind of made up and it's kind of gone now. Don't worry about that. That's never the attitude Jesus takes. And in fact, if Mark wanted to say that, he definitely could, because later on in Mark chapter 7, we're going to see the scene where they accuse Jesus of eating unclean foods or being unclean. He's going to say, it's not what you put into your body, it's what comes out of you that makes you unclean. And then Mark's going to say, and therefore he made all foods clean. So if he wanted to do that with the Sabbath, he could say, and therefore he made the Sabbath invalid, or he made all days holy. That's not what happens. Instead, Jesus argues that the purpose has been lost when they begin focusing on do's and don'ts. They've missed the entire point. What is the point of the Sabbath? It's made for man. What's that saying? It was given to us as a gift. We were not made for it. It's not a bar for us to jump over. It is a gift for us to receive. And what's it ultimately supposed to do? It's supposed to restore us. That's why this next section, the scene that happens right after this in Mark chapter 3, he enters a synagogue. There's a man with a withered hand, and they're watching him to see if he's going to heal on the Sabbath so that they can accuse him. And he knows that, and he calls the man into them. And he says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? And they were silent. So he looked at them. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and he tells them to stretch out his hand. And he's healed. God's showing is that the Sabbath is ultimately supposed to be about restoring, healing, caring for mankind. God gives us the gift of rest. And that's also particularly why it's important for us to realize that throughout history, when people have talked about this, they've always said does not include works of mercy where you care for someone, right? If you're driving home and you see someone broken down the side of the road, you don't say, oh, well, my pastor said it's the Sabbath. I'm not going to help. I can't help out. Or works of necessity. In Matthew chapter 12, you get the same sort of situation unfolding, and he says, if your ox falls in the ditch, aren't you going to help it? There are certain things that just have to be done. And so if that's what your job is doing that, you don't need to feel guilty about it, but instead you do it unto the Lord, realizing that God has called you to serve in a particular way. But Jesus never just comes out and points to the Sabbath command itself and says, well, God was kind of overstepping his boundaries there. He never comes along and says, well, that was all kind of silly and that's not really what is important. Instead, how does Jesus usually treat the law? He does in Matthew 5. He says, the law will never pass away. I've come to fulfill it, not to dismiss it. And we're called to a greater righteousness. And what is that greater righteousness? It's an obedience from the heart, an obedience that sees the commands of God in light of Jesus' kingdom. But it's never an abandonment of the commands themselves. And Jesus himself, throughout his life, followed this pattern. That's worth thinking about. Jesus, the Son of God, obeyed this commandment perfectly. Jesus' life as he worked as a carpenter day by day by day, every seventh day he would rest. Jesus, the perfect man, rested and enjoyed this pattern with God. Let's make it clear, Jesus does change a few things about Sabbath. One, we are gathered today on Sunday, which would be the first day of the week, right? So something shifts here. Why does that change? Well, Jesus, his last Sabbath before his resurrection, was spent in the grave. Jesus' body was laid to rest on the Sabbath. Jesus spent his last Sabbath as a pre-risen body, dead, laid to rest in the grave. And then Jesus rises on Sunday. And every gospel makes the point of saying, when did Jesus rise? It was the first day of the week. Matthew 28, verse 1, Mark 16, verse 2, Luke 24, verse 1, John 21. The first day of the week, Jesus appears to his people. This day after the seventh day, in the sense this eighth day is now this kind of culminating day where God is going to appear. And so what that ultimately does, what Jesus does by enabling true rest, by dying for our sins, by suffering for our sake, and then rising from the grave, he's made a new creation possible. He's made it so that we can come and receive the true rest, like we read about in Matthew 11, where he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your souls, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart." What's he ultimately saying? I can secure peace, I can secure fellowship, I can secure enjoyment of God. And in his resurrection, he did that. And it moves then from Saturday to Sunday. Something has shifted in the way that the world itself is organized. And that's what I believe this passage in Hebrews 4 is about, which we'll look at next. Hebrews chapter 4, where God's going to be speaking to, or the writer's going to be speaking about God speaking to the people of Israel and saying, "Today, if you hear my voice, do not harden your hearts." And the basic idea here is he's interacting with the story of the people in Exodus, and they've been rescued from Israel, but they're not yet into their final destination place. They're out of Egypt, but they're not in the promised land, and they're stuck in this middle place. And ultimately what they're called to do is they're called to hear the message of God, hear and believe that there is a rest secured for them through the hands of Joshua. Joshua went off into the promised land. He said, "The land is good, we just need to go take it, and the Lord will be with us." They do not believe, and therefore God says, "They shall not enter my rest." They will not experience what I have set apart for them, and so they fall and they die. And Hebrews chapter 4 is drawing this parallel, saying what our ultimate experience is we're a lot like those people in the wilderness. God has rescued us through Jesus. God has defeated death. God has made it so that we can be secure in him. But if we do not endure to the end, then we have no hope. If we fail to have faith, we will not experience the rest that God has set apart for us. And this comparison is being run all the way through, where he keeps going back and saying, "They shall not enter my rest." And the idea is that that's being spoken well after the people finally did enter into the promised land. So what could possibly be happening? And it says in verse 6 of Hebrews chapter 4, "Since therefore it remains for some to enter it," essentially saying, if God can speak to us and say, "You should enter my rest, you have not received it yet," and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long and afterward, in the words already quoted, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, verse 9, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And that word there, that Sabbath rest, is literally Sabbathism. There remains this Sabbathism, this continuing to rest. Why were the people ultimately called to rest back in Exodus and Deuteronomy? Is because God had rescued them and they were looking forward to the day when they would have final rest. Why would God call us to rest today? Because we have been rescued, but we are still looking forward to our final rest. And the text never actually says when Jesus is our rest, so don't worry about it. It says Jesus has secured rest and we ought to look for it. and giving ourselves over weekly to resting in the truth of the gospel is a means by which we can grow in our knowledge of God. And it's only when we see all of this, we have to see this whole structure come in place. We've got to run it all the way through so that then we can begin handling some of those texts that seem to say something otherwise than what we've just been saying. Because you might have been listening to all this, and you're just kind of sitting and thinking, there's this one verse or these couple of verses that he's just simply ignoring and skating over. Romans 14:5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Okay, well, that definitely sounds like, well, stop being a jerk, John. Stop trying to make this such a big deal and just let me esteem the day as I want it to. Or Colossians chapter 2, it's Paul again creating problems for this argument. Colossians 2, verse 16. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. Essentially, why are you letting this be such a big deal? Don't let other people judge you for what you do. And doesn't that undermine everything that I've been saying so far? I think it's important to remember when both of these contexts, we'll kind of address these passages as a pair because I think they're more or less saying the same thing. Both are dealing with this tension between new believers and those who come from a Jewish faith. Both are dealing with food laws, both are dealing with festivals, both are dealing with all of this other stuff. And remember, one thing to note here is look in Colossians 2, when it doesn't just say a Sabbath, it says new moon, festival, Sabbath. And remember what we said at the beginning here. What was the structure that was being built on top of this basic command? It was all of these festivals. The Day of Atonement, the day of the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths, all of this stuff is kind of being built on this basic structure. And then when you look throughout the Old Testament, it will often speak in terms of new moons and festivals and Sabbaths, not referring to this 1 in 7 week or 1 in 7 day pattern, but instead referring to this whole structure. The emphasis here is not so much on whether or not there's one day that should be holy. It's instead on, are you going to be obedient to all these other commands that Christ has fulfilled? In a sense, these commands are pointing us to what Jesus was ultimately going to do, but the point of it, that there is rest to be found in God, still stands, and we have not secured it yet. This new covenant gets rid of this additional structure, but it does not upend this basic reality that we are waiting for rest. And God has given us a gift to anticipate and experience that rest in a small way. Resting in God week to week is not a burden. It is God giving you joy. And if, as Romans 14:5, if we're going to take that and absolutize it, it says, make no day more of a big deal than others. One person esteems this day, another person esteems another day. If we're going to just kind of say, well, that's across the board true and there's nothing we can do, well, the New Testament itself contradicts that. Because the rest of the New Testament, we see regularly in the book of Acts and in 1 Corinthians, the first day of the week is when God's people gather together. That day when they remember Jesus' resurrection, week by week by week. They don't just celebrate Easter once a year, they celebrate it every Sunday. Verse 7 of Acts 20, on the first day of the week when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day. He prolonged his speech until midnight. What's Paul doing? He's gathering with the church, breaking bread, fellowshipping together. Or 1 Corinthians 16, Paul's giving this instruction about this offering that's supposed to be collected. And he says this, verse 16, verse 1, chapter 16, verse 1, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. What's the idea there? Every week, the church is gathering together, and what they're doing, they're adding to this collection. They're gathering and giving their resources to the church, so that you don't have to do that when Paul shows up. They can just hand it to him once he arrives. And then this continues all the way up until Revelation chapter 1, years and years and years later. Here it's just simply called the Lord's Day. We drop in on the Apostle John. He's been exiled. He's sitting on the Isle of Patmos. It says, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance there. And Jesus was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. And I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. What's in the Spirit mean? It means he was praying. He was engaged in worship on the Lord's Day. He continued the rhythm even though he was far away from any church. John kept track of the days based on the rhythm of weekly worship. So that's my case for why I think this is relevant. I think evidence shows itself that there's a gift that's being offered and held up to us here, something that continues to be valid. And there's plenty more that we could explore as far as how to ultimately think about what we do, how we are obedient to this. But what I want us to kind of end here is just saying, what is ultimately the big deal? Maybe that's what's been kind of brushing through your mind. You think, all that sounds good and it's all interesting biblical stuff, but really, why does God care what I do with one day and 7? Well, if God can't ask this, what can he ultimately ask you for? If God exists and can make all things, and we believe that's true, then why does it rub us so strangely that God would ask for a day of worship? I think sometimes we like to think that we'd be willing to make the big sacrifices if the Lord were to ask them of us. That we would be willing to hold fast to the truth. We'd be willing to suffer. We'd be willing to hold and be faithful. But is it not the case that if this command is binding on us, if it holds something out, that we're simply unwilling to make those sacrifices? It is an inconvenience. It is. But if God is offering us something in it, then why would we not take it? I think at the end of the day, that this commandment just has this way of kind of sticking in our craw in a way that makes us uncomfortable. The other three, the three preceding this, they kind of seem so abstract, it's kind of really hard to just point at someone and say they're breaking it. The other ones, we kind of understand that those are issues, but this one just feels, it demands this kind of concreteness to our life with God that makes it uncomfortable. But let's ask the question, let's drive this home just for us. Why is it that in our list of priorities, gathering together with God's people is always the weakest link in the chain? Why is it that always falls to the wayside first before anything else does? If nothing else, let's take that point away. Let's consider what it means for God to give us a day to enjoy him. And before we do anything else with this task, before we think about, well, what does that mean for my job? What does it mean for when I'm traveling? What does it mean for the way I interact with other people? What does it mean? What am I supposed to do? What I ultimately want us to land the plane on here today is let's see that the ultimate point of it is for us to remember God. The gift of the Sabbath is to be reminded that God has done all things for us. In Jesus Christ, we're ultimately told, when Jesus begins his ministry in Luke chapter 4, he stands up and he quotes Isaiah, and he quotes it's making references to this Jubilee, this kind of Sabbath of Sabbaths, where he's going to say, I'm going to heal the blind, I'm going to make the lame leap with joy, I'm going to rescue the prisoners. And what does Jesus ultimately then do so that we might have rest? He dies for us. He dies upon a cross. He sacrifices himself because we could not do this work. And now he's risen and he is in the presence of God. And he bids us to come and to look forward to his coming. So before you do anything else with this command, rest and enjoy Jesus. Believe that Jesus has died and risen and lives forever, that he will come and that all of our labor, all of our toil, it will one day cease. And in Jesus, there is rest.